Imagine spending 40 years polishing the same silverware, pressing the same shirts, and walking the same corridors in silence. You wake before dawn and collapse after midnight. You know the smell of your master's favorite tobacco, the exact temperature he likes his tea, and the precise way his wife wants the roses arranged every Sunday morning. And then one Tuesday afternoon, without warning, a bell rings. You are called into the study. The master does not look at you. He slides an envelope across the polished wood. Inside is your final wage, and a letter thanking you for your years of service. 40 years, reduced to an envelope. You have 24 hours to leave the only home you have ever known. This is not fiction. This is not a scene from a novel or a dramatic exaggeration for effect. This happened to thousands upon thousands of servants across Victorian England. Real people, real lives, discarded like broken furniture. And where they went after that front door closed behind them, what became of their bodies and their minds and their dignity, is one of the darkest and most deliberately hidden chapters in British history. In this video, we will pull back the curtain on the brutal reality that costume dramas never show you. You will learn how a system designed to look like family was actually a machine built to extract labor and discard human beings the moment they stopped being useful. And you will discover where these people actually ended up when the world they served threw them away. But first, I need to destroy a myth that most people still believe. If you have watched a period drama, you have seen the scene. The kindly lord places his hand on the old butler's shoulder and says something warm about loyalty. The servants laugh together in the kitchen. Everyone belongs. Everyone is safe. It is a beautiful picture, and it is almost entirely a lie. When a young person entered service, usually between 12 and 15, they were absorbed into a closed world. The great house became their universe. They slept under its roof, ate from its kitchen, and wore clothes chosen to match the household's status. Every basic need appeared to be met. This created a powerful illusion. The servant began to believe an unspoken contract existed. If I give you my youth and my loyalty, you will care for me when I am old. But this bond had an expiration date, and the servant was always the last to know when it arrived. The moment a butler's hands trembled while pouring wine, or a maid moved too slowly on the stairs, the clock started ticking. Not a clock of compassion, a clock of calculation. Employers watched. They noticed when the silver was not polished to standard, when the ironing showed creases, when failures crossed an invisible threshold. The decision was made. The cruelty was not in the individual decision. It was in the system that made dismissal inevitable while spending decades pretending it would never come. And when that envelope slid across the desk, the servant did not just lose a job. They lost everything. Home, friends, routine, identity, purpose, all at once. A butler who had managed 20 staff members for 30 years woke up the next morning in a rented room with nothing to do. No one to instruct, no schedule, no bell to answer. The silence was deafening. For the first time in decades, nobody needed him. Nobody called his name. He had no purpose. Many described this experience in terms we would now recognize as severe psychological trauma, a total collapse of identity. They did not know who they were without the uniform, without the routine, without the house that had defined their existence. Some wandered the streets near their former homes, unable to let go. They stood across the road and watched the windows light up in the evening, knowing that inside, someone else was pouring the wine, laying the table, and answering the bell that used to be theirs. It was a kind of grief that had no name in the Victorian vocabulary, the death of a life that was still technically being lived. But the system had one more trick to ensure servants could never truly escape its grip, and that trick was money. Or more precisely, the deliberate, calculated absence of it. You might think that servants in wealthy households saved enough to survive. The answer is no, and it was no by design. A typical housemaid earned between £12 and £16 per year. A modest room in London cost over £10 annually. Her entire salary could barely cover rent alone. But servants did not pay rent while employed, so surely they saved their wages. This is what employers argued. It sounds logical until you see what actually happened to that money. Servants were expected to maintain their appearance, purchasing gloves, stockings, and shoes from their own wages. A single pair of quality gloves could cost a week's pay. There was enormous pressure to send money to poor relatives in the countryside. After these expenses, the average servant had 2 or 3 pounds left per year. Over a 30-year career, with perfect discipline and 0 emergencies, that amounts to roughly 60 to 90 pounds. After dismissal, rent, food, coal, and medicine would consume this in 18 months. Then nothing. This dependency was not accidental. Household guides openly recommended low cash wages combined with provided necessities. The reasoning was explicit. A servant with savings has options. A servant without savings has nowhere to go. Low wages ensured obedience. The state pension system did not exist. The Old Age Pensions Act was not passed until 1908, providing only 5 shillings weekly to people over 70. For most former servants, far too late and far too little. Financial literacy was never taught to servants. They learned obedience and how to manage their master's money. Never their own. They did not understand interest rates or investment. They did not know how to spot a scam, and there were plenty of scammers ready to exploit them. Newspapers of the era were filled with advertisements for miraculous investment schemes, promising extraordinary returns. Desperate elderly servants, clutching their small savings, trusted these promises because they had no framework for skepticism. They handed over their last pounds to confidence men who vanished overnight. Social propaganda insisted that the poor were poor because they were wasteful. But how can you be thrifty when your annual income barely covers necessities? This rhetoric only deepened the shame of those who had nothing, making them blame themselves for a situation that was engineered by others. The entire system was designed to keep servants dependent until the very end. Savings would give them freedom of choice, and freedom of choice for a servant was the last thing an employer wanted. If you are feeling the weight of what these people went through, it means you understand something Victorian society refused to acknowledge, that this system was fundamentally broken. If you believe these forgotten stories deserve to be heard, subscribe to The Dreadful History. We uncover the human cost behind the grand facades of history, and there is much more to tell. Because what servants did next to delay the inevitable is where this story turns truly disturbing. What would you do if a single gray hair could cost you everything? This was reality for aging servants, and their answer reveals a hidden industry of desperation in the shadows of every great house. Gray hair was the most dangerous sign of aging. A butler with gray temples might as well have worn a sign reading, "Replace me." So servants dyed their hair with homemade concoctions that would horrify a modern chemist. Lead-based mixtures were popular. They produced convincing color, but slowly poisoned the user, causing tremors, memory loss, and organ failure. But every servant performed the same terrible calculation. Lead poisoning might kill me in 10 years. Losing my job will destroy me in 10 months. They chose the slow death every time. Female servants faced worse pressure. As their bodies aged, they used tight corsets not for fashion, but to physically hold their frames together. The pain was managed with laudanum, a cheap opium tincture. A few drops dulled the morning ache. By evening, they needed it to function. Addiction accelerated decline, which brought dismissal closer, which increased desperation. A spiral with one ending. Then there were the teeth. Tooth loss was an unacceptable sign of age for servants at the dining table. The solution was dentures made from real human teeth, extracted from corpses, known as Waterloo teeth. Servants spent precious savings on dead strangers' teeth to maintain a healthy appearance. The teeth rarely fit. They caused infections, but they were better than dismissal. Glasses were also forbidden. A servant with spectacles was considered incompetent. Many worked nearly blind, navigating by memory and touch, memorizing the location of every piece of furniture and ornament. Every morning began with examination in the mirror. Each new wrinkle triggered panic. Powder was applied. Cheeks were pinched for color. Posture was forced straight, despite screaming muscles. The cruelest part? Employers usually knew. They saw the dyed hair and squinting eyes. They tolerated the performance as long as it held. But the moment a tray was dropped or knees buckled on the stairs, the tolerance vanished. Dismissal had been anticipated for months. They had been watching, waiting, calculating when the cost of keeping the aging servant would exceed replacing them. But if losing your position was the nightmare's beginning, the next destination was its darkest chapter. It had a name that made grown men weep. There was a building in almost every town that people spoke about in whispers. Parents used it to frighten children. Adults crossed the street to avoid its walls, and elderly servants felt their blood turn cold at its name, the workhouse. The philosophy was chillingly simple. If poverty is made sufficiently miserable, people will avoid it. Conditions inside must always be worse than the worst conditions outside. This was the principle of less eligibility. It transformed shelters into instruments of psychological warfare. When a former servant arrived, the destruction began immediately. You surrendered your name and received a number. You were no longer James the butler. You were inmate 4471. Your clothes were taken, replaced with a shapeless, humiliating uniform. If you arrived with your spouse, you were separated into different wings, meeting only for supervised minutes on Sundays. The work was deliberately meaningless and exhausting. The elderly, including former servants of dignified indoor work, broke stones for road gravel. Hour after hour. Hands bleeding, joints screaming. Those too frail were given oakum picking, pulling tar-covered ship ropes apart with bare fingers. Tar embedded under nails. Fibers sliced skin. This work served no purpose except to make the experience unbearable. The food reinforced the message. Thin gruel for breakfast, bread with cheese for dinner, more gruel for supper. Inmates were kept perpetually hungry by policy, not necessity. Former servants who had spent careers serving exquisite meals now ate flavorless porridge from tin bowls. The contrast was a cruelty no policy document ever acknowledged. Diseases spread rapidly through overcrowded dormitories. A cold became pneumonia within days. The workhouse infirmary was staffed by other inmates, not doctors. Death in the workhouse carried one final humiliation: burial in a common grave. No headstone, no marker. You vanished from the earth as if you had never existed. The staff's attitude toward residents ranged from indifferent to openly cruel. Guards, often recruited from the same class of poor people, directed their frustrations at the defenseless elderly. There was no complaint system, no oversight. The outside world preferred not to know what happened behind the high walls. Society believed that if someone ended up here, it was their own fault. Being sent to a workhouse was a mark of shame so deep it could never be erased. The very fact of dying here and being buried in a common grave without a headstone frightened Victorians more than death itself. For a former servant who once poured wine into crystal glasses, ending his days with a bowl of thin gruel was the collapse of his entire universe. Many servants chose death on the streets over entering. They preferred freezing under a bridge to this systematic destruction of their humanity. That is how terrible the workhouse was. The street, with all its cold and hunger, was considered the better option. But what about family? Surely a mother, a brother, a cousin would take them in? The servant at the crossroads of destitution always had one faint hope: home, the village, the family left behind decades ago. This was the cruelest hope of all. Consider the timeline. A girl leaves her village in 1845 at age 14. She works in London for 40 years. She visits home perhaps once every few years. By 1885, dismissed at 54, her parents are dead. Her siblings have scattered. The cottage she grew up in was demolished for a rail line. She arrives and finds nothing she recognizes. Even when family remained, the reunion was rarely warm. Decades of separation had turned relatives into strangers. The returning servant was a mouth to feed. In a cottage where children sometimes went hungry, an additional person who brought no income was not a prodigal daughter. She was a burden. Many returning servants left voluntarily. They could sense the irritation. They could feel the unspoken wish that they would leave. Some could not return at all. Enclosure movements had erased entire villages, houses demolished, communities dispersed. There was nowhere to go back to. The lack of communication infrastructure made things worse. Letters were expensive and slow. Many rural families were illiterate. A servant could arrive at their birthplace and discover that not a single living soul remembered them. It was a devastating realization that you have no roots, no place on earth that claims you as its own. Those who served in one house for decades had become so deeply embedded in someone else's life that they had forgotten how to have their own. They knew the master's preferences, but not their brother's children's names. They could recite the household inventory from memory, but could not navigate the market in their home village. Service had not just employed them, it had consumed them entirely, leaving nothing behind when it was finished. The result was a uniquely Victorian form of social homelessness. Not just the absence of a physical dwelling, but the complete absence of belonging anywhere at all. Too refined for the village, too poor for the city, too old for service, too proud for begging. They existed in a social no man's land, claimed by nobody, belonging to nothing. And so the street became their last address. The streets of London held an invisible population. Among them, shuffling along the margins, were former servants of great houses. The first stage was desperate respectability. A dismissed servant still had dignity. They rented the cheapest room, kept clothes clean, and walked the city looking for work. But domestic service was a young profession. A 55-year-old competing against 20-year-olds had no chance. Letters of recommendation were weapons disguised as courtesy. A phrase like, "is now seeking a quieter situation," told any reader, "too old, do not hire." The second stage was improvisation. Former cooks sold cheap pies from trays. Former butlers offered services as crossing sweepers, clearing paths through mud hoping for coins. Humiliating work for people who once served lords. The third stage was visible poverty. Good clothes wore out. The rented room became unaffordable. The former servant became indistinguishable from thousands of other poor. Then something cruel would happen. A familiar carriage would roll past. Inside, the family they had served. The instinct was always the same. Turn away. Hide the face. Shame was stronger than hunger. And the employers, when they recognized a former servant, quickened their pace, pretending they had not seen. The final stage was disappearance. Cheap gin became a companion to the decline. It helped forget the cold and the hunger for a while. It dulled the pain in aging joints and gave the illusion of warmth. But it took away the last strength and clarity in return. Drunken former servants became a common sight at pub doors in poor neighborhoods. They spent nights in fourpence shelters, sleeping huddled together in stuffy rooms or in coffin beds, narrow wooden boxes designed for maximum occupancy. Those without even fourpence slept on benches, under bridges, in doorways, risking freezing to death every winter night. It was a slow agony stretching over months and years. People who were once accustomed to order and cleanliness died in the filth of the streets, becoming nameless entries in police reports. Their stories dissolved into the noise of the city, uninteresting to anyone. Unnecessary to remember, London moved on, as it always did. If this story is changing how you see the past, you are exactly who the dreadful history was built for. A like tells the algorithm that people want the truth, not just the pretty version. And subscribing means you will be here when we pull back the next curtain, because there is still a chapter most people assume would have saved these servants, Victorian charity. The reality will surprise you. Victorian England produced more charitable societies than any previous era. Surely among all these organizations there was something for old servants. There was, but getting through the door required navigating a system so filled with conditions and moral judgments that most applicants gave up or died waiting. Servants' aid societies offered small pensions and residential places, but applications required complete, unbroken references from every employer. A gap of 6 months needed explanation. Any history of misconduct, intoxication, or moral lapse meant automatic denial. Committees of wealthy subscribers asked probing personal questions. Inspectors visited applicants' homes checking for signs of disorder. Even those who passed every test faced waiting lists stretching years. Societies helped dozens per year. The need numbered in thousands. Religion added exclusion. Anglican charities served only Anglicans. Catholic only Catholics. A servant who had been lax in worship found doors closed everywhere. The pensions were modest enough to prevent starvation, but not provide comfort. Recipients were expected to display constant gratitude. Any complaint risked losing benefits entirely. The system assumed poverty was a moral failure. The deserving poor were those who had been perfectly virtuous and thrifty throughout their lives, but somehow still ended up destitute. This category was, by design, almost impossibly narrow. Charity was less a safety net and more a tiny selective umbrella held over a chosen few while thousands drowned around them. But there was one group whose story deserves its own telling. Women who reached the highest ranks and paid the highest price. The pinnacle for women in service was housekeeper or head cook. These were positions of genuine authority, and they came with an unwritten requirement: you could not be married. These women chose career over family, authority over domesticity. For decades, it worked. They were respected, needed, had purpose and status. Then time did what it always does. When dismissal came, these women faced a particular abyss. No husband, no children, no family home. They had sacrificed every safety net for professional excellence, and the profession discarded them. Their pride made the fall worse. A woman who managed 15 staff could not scrub floors. A cook who served earls could not work in a cheap eating house. The standards that made them excellent became barriers to survival. Many ended their lives in small rented rooms surrounded by fading mementos. A photograph of children they helped raise. A trinket given at Christmas. These objects were the only proof they had mattered. They died quietly. Neighbors noticed when the elderly lady stopped appearing at the shop. Not every story ended in darkness. There were rare exceptions that served a purpose more complex than kindness. Almshouses, small residential buildings established by ancient wills, offered rooms and small allowances. Getting in required extraordinary luck. Hundreds competed for each place, which only opened when someone died. Eligibility requirements reflected dead benefactors' quirks. One almshouse might accept only former servants of naval officers born in Devon. Those who secured a place found life that was Spartan but dignified. A room with a door you could close, a small allowance, no degrading labor. You could sit by your fire and remember your life without someone demanding you break rocks. In the evenings, residents drank tea, shared stories, and reminisced endlessly about their past lives in wealthy mansions. These conversations gave them a sense of belonging that the big, cruel world had completely denied them. But even within quiet almshouse walls, death visited frequently. Doctors rarely came. Medicine was unaffordable. As soon as a room became vacant, the next person on the long waiting list moved in. The queue advanced only when someone died. People waited years for their neighbor to pass so they could finally have their own corner. But the greatest prize, the one that made other servants gasp with envy, was the cottage of mercy. A tiny number of servants, almost always those who served a single family their entire career and formed genuine personal bonds, received a small cottage on the estate grounds. Free for life. Food sent from the kitchen. Fuel delivered from the woodpile. Visits from the family on Sundays. This was the fairy tale ending, and here is why it mattered so much to the system. Every young servant who heard about old Mrs. Patterson and her cottage on the Willoughby estate filed that story as proof the system worked. Loyalty would be rewarded. The family bond was real. They never mentioned that for every Mrs. Patterson, 500 former servants died in workhouses. They never calculated the odds. One visible winner obscured a million invisible losers. It was the same mechanism that sells lottery tickets. And the house always wins. We have traveled from polished silver to workhouses, from drawing rooms to doorways, from crystal glasses to tin bowls. The story of Victorian servants is not simply historical curiosity. It is a mirror. The system that discarded these people was built on principles still alive today. That a worker's value equals their current productivity. That providing basic needs absolves further responsibility. That poverty is somehow the poor person's fault. These servants gave everything: youth, health, family, identity. They poured it all into houses that were not their own. And when nothing remained, the response was an envelope and 24 hours to pack. The great houses still stand. You can visit them. Tour guides describe the grand balls and scandals, but they rarely mention the people who lit fires at 4 in the morning, who pressed tablecloths and polished floors and carried meals and opened doors, who lived their entire lives in attic rooms and basement kitchens, in the margins of other people's stories. Those people deserved better. They were not lazy. They were not irresponsible. They were not failures. They were people who did exactly what was asked of them, gave exactly what was demanded of them, and were rewarded with abandonment. The next time you watch a beautiful period drama and see servants gliding silently through candlelit rooms, remember what happened when the candles went out. Remember the butler with lead in his hair, the housekeeper dying alone with a photograph, the old cook selling pies in the rain, the footman sleeping in a coffin bed under a bridge. The distance between what a society claims to value and what it actually does is measured in the lives it throws away. If this story has stayed with you, share it with someone who loves history. Tell us in the comments what you think about how society treated its loyal workers, and whether you see parallels today. If you have not subscribed to The Dreadful History, this is where we refuse to let the comfortable version be the only version told. What happened to servants in ancient Rome? In the Ottoman Empire? In colonial India? Tell us in the comments what you want investigated next. Until next time, remember, the past may be gone, but its lessons are not, and neither are the people who lived it. Thank you for watching.